Afternoon, Tim. How you doing?
Hello, Shabbar. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. Had a restful weekend
Mhm.
watching some sport. England in the T20s versus Nepal. So I was interested in that after my Himalayan adventure. But yeah, nice and restful. So looking forward to another money and life conversation. And this week we're diving into the topic of family history, ancestral behaviors or patterns
Mm.
with money and how that has shaped the way that we might do money. So,
Mhm.
what can listeners expect to take away from today's episode?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is to get people to really think about how ancestral patterns might still be present unconsciously in your money and life challenges or emotions or dynamics. We've talked about various ways of doing what we call detective work, like really trying to understand your patterns. So we've talked about doing experiments with money, noticing what triggers you with money, trying to do different things with money. And we've also talked about, I think it was episode 20 and 21, particularly about the role of your parents and upbringing. And obviously that shapes you with money quite a lot, but that's in your living memory. I think what we haven't talked about and what I want people to think about for today is how might your money dance and your unconscious money patterns be playing out in some way in relation to two, three, four generations before you, where obviously it wasn't in your living memory. So we'll dive in, I think, with some examples and start to think about how we can work with that and how that might help us with our own money stuff.
Right, exciting. I am thinking about the sort of three generations, and I don't know that much about my
Mm,
ancestral
mm.
money behaviors, patterns, influences. So I might be limited to maybe two generations, so like my grandparents, but hopefully that would still paint a picture and we can draw some parallels or
Mm.
interesting detective work can be done around that. So yeah, shall I sort of fire away first? And
But let me say one thing, because
yeah,
you make a really good point. When we're doing ancestral work, obviously we weren't there. And obviously, the further you go back, for most people, most families, the details become quite hazy, or maybe we don't even know at all. Um, it's not necessarily a problem in terms of helping you with your detective work. I say this to everybody. If you do have a sense and you do have a sense of family history and details, that's great. You can really get into that. But if you don't, and many people don't, it's enough just to kind of imagine or spend some time trying to understand based on what I do know. So, where were my great grandparents?
mm,
And you can be creative. You don't have to be like a literal historian. You can think,
yeah,
well, what would life have been? Were they poor? Were they at risk of starvation? Were they very wealthy? Did they travel? Were there wars going on? So you can
mm,
start to imagine that and still feel into what were likely to be some of the key dynamics. So yeah, I say that to everybody. You can absolutely do this even if you don't know details and historical dates. So over to you. Maybe we'll do a bit of both with you, and I'll share some stories from me and clients I've worked with.
yeah, great. So my ancestry goes back to, well, I would say India originally. That might be sort of 4 or 5 generations. And then it moved to East Africa, Tanzania. And I would say that my current community is predominantly made up of Muslims who emigrated 1, 2 generations ago from East Africa. So we're talking about Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda,
Hmm.
just for people who want to sort of locate these places on a map.
Hmm. That have been like your grandparents' generation came over, or your parents?
Yeah, so grandparents typically, and we're looking from the sort of like the 1960s
Hmm.
onwards. Okay, so I think the important thing for me, if I'm reflecting back on this, is that a lot of them came over because of either political instability in their homelands. So, for example, in Uganda, Idi Amin
Hmm.
basically kicked out all of the Asians from Uganda in the 70s. I know that my mum grew up in Zanzibar and there was a revolution in the 1960s,
Hmm.
and that caused a lot of upheaval for families at that time where it was unsafe for children to be around, and they would be sent off to live with relatives in different parts of the country. But then eventually, I think people found that it was unsafe. A
Mhm.
lot of confiscation of property, businesses being taken away, and the appeal of moving to a safer country, i.e., the UK or the US, Canada, Europe, was a big appeal. And so you had this sort of mass exodus towards the West. And people then generally came over with very little
Yeah.
when maybe in their homeland they were quite established and they had
Yeah.
quite a bit more. So that's the sort of dynamic that I'm like coming at with my story.
Mm. Yeah. So again, the thing with ancestral workers, unless you know very, very literally, what you can do is include it as part of what we've called on this podcast your detective work, where we're looking for patterns and threads. So if I reflect back quickly, actually my ancestry shares something quite similar, but also a bit different. But this is often the case for many, many people. You go 3, 4 generations back. The first question is, were my people here? Were they in even the country that I'm in? If the answer is no, then very often there's a big difference between their situation and yours. There can be a big difference anyway. So then you can really imagine, well, what was it like for them? And the pattern you're saying is, well, these are all people who think what you're saying is may have been doing quite well. Actually, they may have been quite established, had some money, felt relatively affluent. That would be a good thing to find out or to have some
Mm.
sense of. But then because of political changes, instability, confiscation, persecution, danger, they came over. So, if you imagine going through something like that, which many people, of course, do every day, but you and I haven't in our lives. You can imagine, and I would really encourage people to do this. You can kind of close your eyes. You can imagine the conversations probably for weeks or months before, neighbors leaving, friends leaving, having to make painful decisions, maybe selling stuff up, or maybe some people had to leave in secret. Or it's like actually the step is to get into a feeling of what must that have been like, and really to try and connect with the emotional atmosphere of that. And again, if you don't know, you can also assume that whatever you feel into that, so if for you it's scary or sad or whatever, that's probably a good reflection of some part of your process anyway, right? The thing you're imagining will be a reflection of your unconscious process. But you can really imagine that. So if, we won't do a deep dive for you today, but for me, there is something about a profound instability, maybe some grief, sadness, and fear in leaving. And then I think what you're describing is a radical change in my material, financial kind of, let's say, security or level. So you can imagine the emotions of leaving. You can also imagine, well, okay, what happened when they arrived? Because you didn't probably just jump on a flight and check into a nice hotel or step in.
No.
You probably had, again, weeks or months or years of arriving in a country where you maybe didn't speak the language, didn't understand how the systems work, maybe there weren't safety nets. And then many of these stories, people have to kind of build themselves up over decades or a generation or two. So let me pause there. I could make some more general comments, but which bits of any of that, or maybe I'm missing something as well, which bits kind of feel like they fit with your family story?
Yeah, and I think I probably need to stress that with sort of the East African connection,
Mm.
there were within that community, there were people who were obviously at different levels of
Of course.
wealth. So I think there were those that would have come over and had more financial support and
Mm.
backing, or maybe had bigger families. And if you're not the first one to come over, then you've got the added maybe support of a network. And so I think all of those things need to be factored in. But
Mm.
I hear a multitude of stories of, those that came over with a bit of privilege because they had
Mm.
some money, and those that came over with nothing, those that had bigger families who then had a support network, and those that maybe felt a little bit more alone. So there's a real multitude of different experiences. But if I focus on my dad's story, for example,
Mhm.
like I know that he came over more because of opportunity in education
Mhm.
and not because of persecution or instability. as such, but his parents were of quite a poorer background.
Mhm.
So, very working class. So that also plays into like the narrative that I have around my dad coming and hearing how he used to, juggle 3 or 4 jobs while
Yes.
studying.
Yes.
And that's always been
Yes.
one of the stories growing up. And I've never really paid much attention to it,
Mm.
but he used to tell me how he worked at a petrol station and then he used to do the car valet and, worked at a wimpy bar and was still trying to study for his engineering degree at the same time. And I'm thinking, wow, like that's, all in his early 20s, that's quite a big responsibility. And then, eventually bringing parents over to settle in the UK, it's quite a big story of
Mm.
trial, tribulation, and adventure,
And a lot of hard work.
and a lot of hard work.
And one of the things I notice it's for me the single most common pattern that I noticed ancestrally, if you're kind of second generation, or maybe I mean third generation, like your grandparents, is a work hard driver.
Big
Work
time.
hard, keep working, and don't stop. And I'm not knocking it, as we say on this podcast all the time. There's nothing wrong with being lazy, and there's nothing wrong with working hard, and there's nothing wrong with working till you never stop or chilling out. It's whether we're locked into a pattern or a way of being that no longer serves us or is narrow, but we can't get out of it. And one of the most common things I notice is people who are gripped in their lifetime by a kind of work hard, never stop, keep going energy. And it can be very helpful to understand that that may have been the reality and in some ways very necessary for people 2 or 3 generations back. Maybe I tell a story of another example.
Before you
Yeah,
do, can I just
yeah,
lock in on something that you said,
sure.
which I think causes a reaction in me, and I'm
Yes.
sure listeners who
Uh-huh.
aren't regular listeners, but you said there's nothing wrong with being lazy. And
Uh-huh.
there's part of me that's screaming out, say, Tim, what the hell are you saying?
Mm,
There's nothing wrong with being lazy. And
mm,
I think that it might be good just to clarify or
mm.
expand on what are you saying?
Maybe we do a whole episode on laziness. Well, okay. What I'm saying, in terms of this work and this podcast, I'm saying a few things. I always approach any part of human behavior by assuming there's nothing wrong with it in essence. And the problem is always being what I would call one sided, which is a term from Jungian psychology that I take from a guy called Arnie Mindell. So for me, the problems we have, not just for me, but drawing on a whole body of knowledge, are when we can only express one side of human behavior and we're stuck in that. And then we use that for every situation and we can't find our way out of it. And also we don't know that we're stuck. So anytime I find myself saying there's nothing wrong with hard work, I will almost automatically say, and what's the opposite of hard work? Being lazy. There's nothing wrong with that. Because to me, these are two aspects of being alive. And I would say in our lives at certain times, it's wonderful, consciously, deliberately, and in response to the situation. It's wonderful to work hard. It's wonderful to give every bit of effort. It's wonderful to have goals and pursue. These are great, exciting energies. And I've coached many people who, when they can only do that, they get burnt out, they get depleted. They're very, very busy, but their lives feel hollow and empty. They work hard, but their relationships get depleted. So there's always a shadow side if we can only be one way. For those people, learning to be what I would say consciously lazy, like, you can stop, you can relax, you can enjoy. That can be a much more challenging than working hard. Both are good. I think there might be a whole podcast on this.
Yeah.
Bertrand Russell, who was, maybe the greatest or one of the greatest English philosophers, he wrote a book and a long essay called In Praise of Idleness. And he was talking about how important it was to be able to connect with this possibility of not having to be productive the whole time. So the idea goes very deep, and there's more to be said. The other thing you can say about why is it good to be lazy is you can look at the world and say, well, we're in a world where there's more and more industry and work, and we're all about productivity and efficiency and output and growth. But is it the right sort of growth? Is it the right sort of activity? Or is it just more, 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 more? And I think for most of us on the individual level and collectively, when you stop and look, it's not quite so simple that just activity good, resting
Yeah.
or stopping bad. So I hope that helps.
I think
And
that's
it's a good
good.
catch that you
Yeah, good.
noticed it. Okay. If you're watching on video, you'll have noticed I've just taken off my little gilet, and Shabba told me it's been making noises when my mic rubs against it. So I'm sorry if the audio's not been very good. That's why I'm now just in my sweater.
And a lovely and it is.
Thank you very much. And I bought it on Vinted for £5, so that might be another podcast
That's another
that we
that's
do.
another episode.
I wasn't trying to save money. I was trying to not buy new clothes for environmental reasons. But okay. May I share an example?
Go for it.
Because it links. I may have talked about this person before on the podcast. I did one of my 2-day money workshops with people. Quick plug. There's a workshop coming up online 26th of March, 2026. 4 half days, details on my website, timothymalnick.com. So do come. So I run them 4 days over afternoon sessions, half days online. But in this case, it was an in-person workshop over 2 full days. And there's a lovely man who I've since got to know and became a friend and kind of colleague. And at that stage, he was a fairly successful corporate lawyer. He'd spent his life in law. He'd been successful and financially was well off and successful and brought up 2 daughters. And the point is, he had enough money. By all calculations, he could stop working financially. He was probably in his 60s by then. And he knew it. And not only that, but unlike many people who've been working their whole lives, he actually had many, many passions of things he wanted to do in the community, in local politics, in society. So there were things he wanted to do that wouldn't bring in money. There was a successful career he'd had that given him money, but he still was finding it excruciatingly difficult to stop doing the day job. And he was quite self-aware. So he knew that, well, what's going on? There's something here. And we explored and we explored. And I don't remember how he got the insight. It may have been through a general discussion in the group. But he made the connection back to his Irish ancestry. So if this guy was 6, so he was probably born in the 50s. So I would say maybe 3 or 4 generations back, but still something talked about, even though it would have been 150 years ago, were the great Irish potato famines of the 1840s and 1850s, where I think 1/3 of the population of Ireland either died or emigrated. There was kind of a decade of starvation, right? So that story was not his life. I don't think he was born in Ireland. Certainly now he was very affluent. There were no obvious food shortages. He could stop. But in those days, and for a generation or 2 after, you had to work. I mean, literally, you couldn't stop working, trying to grow food, get money, or you would die. And 1 million people died, right? And 1 million people emigrated. And it was incredibly helpful for him to be able to track the bit of him that could not stop. And that had a big resistance. It was like a visceral thing, an emotional thing, and almost like a guilt thing. It was a combination of all of these, like, even though I know the numbers say I can stop, I can't stop. It's like the world ends if I stop. He couldn't understand that and why it had such a grip over him until we tracked back that, well, maybe for your great, great, great grandparents, that was true, or at least that felt incredibly true. And if that story, if that's a life and death situation, and then probably family members died and it gets transmitted, and that's what people talk about, you can absorb the story at a deep level of work hard or you die. And then that can be playing into your psychology and your decisions out of your awareness because you don't even know where it's come from.
Yeah.
And so him seeing that was super helpful. And maybe towards the end of the podcast, I can talk about what you might then do to honor the story of your ancestors but no longer be trapped in it, because that becomes very important. But anyway, he was able to sort of free himself up. And he did then step away from his paid work, and he's done some amazing things in sort of community and social spaces.
That's a really amazing story because it highlights how deep and
Yeah.
impactful the narrative and the stories that are passed down can be. When you were talking about that and his desire to keep going, I almost felt like it was like an identity thing, as
Yeah.
in, you know, we're Irish and we kind of work hard and graft, etc., which I think is quite common with a lot of ancestral sort of generalizing, but even within my community. But actually, when you said it, for him, it was a case of life or death in terms of connecting the story about how people
Mm.
had died. And so that's like a really hard one to shift because that's on an existential level. It's almost like, well, if I stop working, it's not an identity, it's a life or
It's
death kind of,
even beyond.
it's
Yeah. So
even
it's what
beyond
is
that.
existence. I think it's not so much that it's hard to shift, although it takes some work. I think it's hard to see.
Mm,
Because when it goes that deep, yeah, you're right. It's not just an identity like, well, we're Irish, we work
mm,
hard. It's more in your physiology. And actually, people now who do a lot of work on generational trauma, because we're talking about trauma here, which is not the case for everybody if you go back in your ancestry, but it's surprisingly common because human history being what it is, you go 3 or 4 generations back, and many, many, many people are here because of some sort of traumatic situation: war, displacement, starvation, slavery, some sort of injustice. Really gives you an angle on human history, actually. But people are doing research on what they now call, I think, epigenetic trauma. In other words, these traumatic responses. So I might be locked into in my life some sort of fear response, which makes me keep working. Kind of on some level, I just feel scared or insecure or vulnerable if I
mm,
don't keep working. And that just becomes, yeah, my identity, just how I experience the world.
mm.
Now, that can be transmitted in many ways through stories, through belief systems, through culture, but they seem to be suggesting that it can be transmitted somehow through your genes or your
Mhm.
physiology. So it's actually a kind of genetic physiological experience. I still think once you see that, and this is why we're doing this episode and encouraging people to think about it, there are a couple of steps you can take. They might not release you totally from your genes or your physiology, but they can really help you shift your relationship to it.
Yeah, I just thought of a client story
Mhm.
which um, is has parallels, but brings a slightly different symptom. And I've got a lady who's again worked very hard um, in the NHS for many years. She's
Mm.
worked since she you know can remember, and her ancestry is Scottish. And she was telling me in one of our meetings, and I was talking to her, well, just treat yourself,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
she was sort of umming and ahhing about the long travel that she would have to do to go and visit the places that she wanted. And I was just like, well, book yourself a business class. Oh, no, no, no. Like, couldn't
Mm.
do that. And I was like, oh, okay, that's
Mm.
interesting. Well, we explored it a bit more. And her parents and grandparents grew up working, I believe it was in the docks. So
Mm.
I don't know what part of Scotland, but I'm sure there was a big kind of community around sort of like the marine docks, etc. And she had picked up this or witnessed this work ethic, which was, like you said, like, every day you go to work, you work hard, you come back, but you also don't spend. You're very, very careful around spending.
Mm.
And that had translated. And even though now she's got more money than she could spend and could do the things that bring her comfort and, enjoyment as well. And there is still that, yes, but we don't spend.
Yeah.
And that had been brought down from generations.
And we looked at some episodes on spending.
Yeah.
Again, maybe episode sort of 30, something around there. People could look at that. Yes, and what I want to say about that, again, these ancestral stories are transmitted in different ways and over different periods. So one could be hard work, and nothing wrong with hard work. It's just when you're locked into it and can't do the opposite, your life becomes limited. So can be an economic driver. So we're poor, we have to keep working, we're immigrants, we have 4 jobs, etc. And that's something to look out for because it may no longer be relevant to your situation. Another very strong driver, which particularly links to, and by the way, don't use your money to enjoy yourself, don't treat yourself. That can often be a religious thing. So there can be a kind of Protestant Puritan, I think often in Scotland, parts of this country, there's a deep suspicion actually of enjoying yourself, and so it's very one-sided. Work hard and don't enjoy the fruits of your labour. Work hard, maybe because of security, but actually working hard is more to do with being serious and doing
Yeah.
good and etc. And the idea of just kick back and enjoy and fly business class, that can threaten things not just economically, but almost like I'm being irreligious or disobeying an ancestral pattern. So kind of faith systems and belief systems, and what were my family telling themselves about what is good, ethical, and godly. That's also a very good thing for people to look into, um, because I would say ideally, our senses of how we relate to the divine can evolve, can develop as we mature, as we grow. There's a way to still honor the threads of a faith system that may be in our family, but actually really live it in a kind of holistic modern way. But if we're not careful and don't do that, we just get trapped by feelings of guilt, or I must never enjoy myself, or my money's not for me, and that can absolutely limit us. I've seen that many times with people.
Yeah, so true. And just to sort of flag up, we in episodes 20 and 21, we did talk
Yeah,
about how we've inherited stories and patterns
yeah,
from parents and how we've passed these on to maybe our
yeah,
children. So episodes 20 and 21, we
yeah.
did dive a bit deeper into some of those themes. And I think the religion one did actually come up there.
And the point is, our parents are passing on their stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that may have come back. Maybe I'll just share my own story
Yeah.
because it has similarities to yours. And just for people listening, we're sharing these not because there's anything remarkable about our stories, but just as illustrations of the sorts of patterns that there are there. And there may be different ones towards them. Maybe I'll name a couple of other patterns, other people. And maybe you've got clients as well who you see this in. So I think there's an amazing phrase my uncle said to me. My uncle made a lot of money. He had a very successful photography business. Um, but my people come from largely Eastern European Jews, or certainly Jews who've wandered around Europe looking for safe places, because the history of Jews in Europe is, in some places they've been there for a while, sometimes maybe for a few hundred years, and sometimes much less. But the archetypal pattern is they've never been safe. And this is actually quite a hard thing to understand if you don't have a connection with Jewish culture, because certainly today people can look at Jews, they've got all sorts of ideas, often relatively wealthy. But this comes from hundreds years of being in different countries, more or less established and more or less secure, but never, ever of the ruling class, never, ever of the national religion. So being a sort of an insider and an outsider, like your ancestry, sometimes being quite well off relatively and sometimes not. So my people came, I don't think were particularly well off from the Ukrainian steppes, from eastern Ukraine as it is now, bits of Poland. But they came over before the Second World War and mainly before the First, but as a result of persecution, what's called pogroms, right? When for various reasons, governments or local politicians or leaders, something went bad, blame the Jews. And again, either the Jews have to convert or they get killed or they have to leave. That's pretty much the deal. And so this was very interesting for me to understand because I wasn't brought up religious at all. So although I know I'm Jewish and feel culturally Jewish, it's not been a big part of my identity. But the phrase my uncle said when I was talking to him about this and I was exploring my Jewish ancestry and how it shaped me and how somehow, even though I look like absolutely a white, educated, middle class man, I tick all the boxes of privilege and inclusion in this society, I always feel a bit of an outsider. I never really feel really like I fit in with my idea of a kind of English British culture. Might seem really crazy to someone watching, but there's always a feeling, A, of being a bit on the edge, and B, there's a kind of a fear or an insecurity, and it's deep, it's visceral. It's like my Irish friends work hard thing. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's there. And it took me a long time, and it was incredibly helpful to understand that that feeling wasn't just me, wasn't just my problem, wasn't just to do with my childhood, although all of those things are also true. That it made sense that for many generations until the last two, my people, it's like, however well you're doing, always be looking around. It could be taken away at any point. And I don't mean just your wealth. I mean, you could be killed. You give the wrong person the wrong look at the wrong time, and you could be killed. And so it's really helpful to kind of go, oh my God, I kind of feel like that in ways I cannot explain. And in my life, I've wanted to speak more and share more weird ideas, but I feel very scared to do that. So it was incredibly helpful. And the phrase, I'll come on to it, that my uncle said was, he said, yeah, he said, when I was sharing some of my discoveries, he said, the thing about us Jews, he says, is doesn't matter how well you're doing, you've always got a suitcase packed at the door.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I went, bloody hell. And obviously, he doesn't mean literally, but there's always that sense. And I found that the reason I'm sharing it is because it helped me in my life understand that this thing that I had struggled with in my own life around a fear and edginess and never quite belonging, even though, white, educated, taught like this, blah, blah, blah. It was like, oh, and it was very helpful and relieving. And then we can do work to kind of honor the ancestors and separate from that story a little bit, just like my Irish friend did as well.
Yeah. No. Thanks for sharing that. I think that just shows how even when you're living, well, you're in Bristol, as you
Yeah,
said. Yeah. White, privileged, educated, yet
yeah,
you're still carrying
yeah,
the baggage. You know,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and
And we do. We all
yeah,
do.
with the time that we've got left,
Yeah,
do you want to sort of talk through
yeah,
the steps that
yeah.
someone takes, and maybe reflect, on the steps that you took, because that
Yes.
was quite profound.
Yeah. Well, let me name briefly a couple of other groups and patterns. I just want to kind of name in order to honor them and because they might be relevant to people listening and because I see them. One obvious one, certainly in this country, in the US, is ancestral slavery. Slavery was abolished in America later than the Irish potato famine, right? I think it was 1861, around the 1860s. Um, so if my friend is still living out unconsciously the effects of what was going on in his ancestry in the 1840s, 1850s, if we've had uh, ancestors who were slaves, that's going to be playing out. It's not for me to say how, but that's something I think to honor. And I know there's a lot of work doing that, and Bristol's doing a lot of work about becoming aware of slavery. But on the kind of personal family line, I think that's really worth people exploring. And if anyone is listening and would like to know how they might do that around money, please be in touch. But there are people who do that. And the other thing in general, and we talked about this in the last few episodes, we talked about, well, what happens if my financial reality is very different from those who've gone before me? And so sometimes, I mean, in this country, we talk about class differences. I don't want to get into a whole class conversation. But I have noticed when people have come from what they would say is a working class, but a kind of proud and happy, healthy working class background. So not starving, not fleeing, but just doing certain jobs, certain level of material wealth. But actually life was good. Maybe a lot of community, a lot of connection, a lot of pride. What I've noticed, and that's not just from family, that might be again for generations, we've been here doing this. I find those people often experiencing themselves a conflict or a tension, and almost like there's a limit on what they're able to earn or expect in their lives, even if their life wants to move in that direction. There can be a feeling that, well, my life or my creativity could move in this direction, and that might open up lots of money to come, or lots of kind of status, or lots of connections, almost like to step into a different part of society. And they often find that very difficult because they feel some sense of either a disloyalty to a kind of proud ancestry, a disloyalty, or that they don't belong somewhere else, or that by stepping into, another possibility of material wealth or access or something, that they're sort of betraying something that's gone before. So I've noticed that. And so I can go on to steps, but maybe back to you. Any other kind of examples you've seen from clients or in workshops?
Well, I think it was a couple of weeks ago that we were discussing around also that I think you mentioned just like the guilt just now, but then
Mm.
realizing and being comfortable with the privilege that you have. And then so that was the only thing that I was going to add, that,
Mm.
in terms of when dealing with this, it's quite complicated.
Well, we've been talking the last few episodes about projections in relationship, right? We've been talking about relationship. If I have more money, if I have less money, if I think they've got more or less. So it's confused enough in just us. So it does whip it up more. I think you said it very beautifully. It gets more complicated, but one step, you were asking about steps. I would say there's maybe 2 or 3 steps to working with this. The first is like the detective work. It's what we've been talking about. It's just starting to become more conscious of what was going on, what might have been the feeling, the driver. Did they have to work hard to eat? Did they have to flee and they were in fear? Who knows what it might be? Was the fact that when they came over, family was the thing that kept them alive, so loyalty to family was transmitted? Just try and get to as clear as you're able in your own feeling about what were the key things going on there that had an emotional charge, and what were those patterns. We don't judge the patterns, they're just patterns, but we don't have to live them out. Then the next step, I think, is to thank your ancestors. Because bottom line is, if they hadn't survived, you wouldn't be here. That's how it works. So if they hadn't done whatever they'd done, work hard during the famine, found a way to move to America, work 4 jobs, I mean, maybe you'd have been here. But the point is, your ancestors are your ancestors, and you're here. So by definition, you could be really grateful and appreciative for your life, right? And we don't know the sacrifices or the lives of ancestors, but and I really mean this, you can kind of do it in your imagination, you can do it visually, you can imagine them on a seat next to you and have a little
Mm.
conversation. But I really encourage people, you drop from the head and kind of get into the heart and actually say, well, I know life must have been really difficult for you. Or maybe it wasn't difficult. I know you felt you had to do this, that, or the other. Well, whatever the story is. But whatever you did, it made sense to you at the time, and it's allowed your family to continue. And I'm grateful for what you did, whether there was pain, suffering, excitement, pressure, whatever. So I think if you really feel that appreciation and find your way kind of more in the heart, that's a really great step. And then the final thing is to consider it the other way around. And this is what you were talking about. I think it's fair to say that what your ancestors would most want to know is that you're doing all right and that you're having a good life. And if they had to suffer or sacrifice or live their lives a particular way, if you could actually say, and wow, I'm doing this now and I have this opportunity. And this is where you can actually say, thank you for everything you did. Thank you for the story. And my life is different now. So I'm absolutely respecting you and appreciating you, but I'm going to live my own story now.
Yeah.
And that's a way of separating with respect.
I mean, it's just so beautiful when you frame it, and
Mm.
framing makes it sound as if it's not actually real, but it is real.
Mm.
And what a way to honor everything that they've done and be conscious about whether it's spending or saving or retiring or going on business class trips or doing whatever it is, and not have the guilt
Yeah.
and the baggage, but instead almost like flipping it and
Yes.
actually, wow, I'm getting to do
Yeah.
this because of your sacrifice or the things that you had to endure, and through this I'm honoring them.
Yeah.
And it's funny how we get stuck in the identity, and we feel like we're honoring them through the being
Yes.
stuck.
Yes. Well, this is the point. We're either unconsciously loyal, which is when I'm stuck in your story. I can only repeat the past. And if I change the past or do something different, I feel like I'm being disloyal. For me, that's unconscious loyalty, like I'm stuck.
Yeah.
Conscious loyalty is saying, I love and respect you. I honor this pattern. And also, we could say, I see the wisdom in this pattern. So I always will work hard and I will make wise spending decisions and da da da. And I also able to see there's a limitation in that pattern. So as part of my loyalty to you, dear Scottish great grandmother, I'm going to fly business class to Honolulu and have a cocktail. And I'm going to do that actually because I imagine that if you could have done something a bit like that in your life, you would have loved that, but you either couldn't or felt you couldn't.
Yeah. I mean,
It's quite deep, isn't it?
it's quite deep, but it's so freeing. I mean, I feel quite free just having that now in my
Mm,
tool bag to be able to sort of whatever it is that I investigate and find out, and doing that from a more conscious position and being loyal in the conscious sense, and acting with more freedom, in agency of how to make decisions and not be stuck in a
yeah.
particular pattern. And I think that's wonderful.
And that boils down because what your ancestors would most want is you being here free or as free as you can to live your life well with and without money. Because that's what we all want.
I think so. Anything to add, Tim, before we close for
I
today?
think I think we've done plenty. It's quite a lot. I'd love to know what people think if you've got questions specific to your situation or general comments, because it's a big topic and it's quite a deep topic. So I hope we've done it justice and opened up some good curiosity for people.
I think we have. I'll see you next time, Tim.
Thanks, Shabba. See you soon.